In a world where power hides behind closed doors and secrets are traded like commodities, one man stands at the crossroads of truth and deception. Agent Blake isn't your average FBI investigator. He's a shadow in the world of high-stakes finance. A man who wears the badge of the Bureau with a mind sharp enough to cut through the lies that mask the real game. But his latest assignment is unlike any he's faced before. Blake has been handed a case involving Victor Steele, a notorious Wall Street investor whose empire is built on manipulation, insider trading, and cold-blooded ambition. Steele is untouchable, a titan in the financial world, beloved by the public and feared by his competitors. But beneath the surface of his success lies a tangled web of corruption, bribery, and betrayal. And Blake is the man who will unravel it. The problem? Steele isn't just a criminal. He's an enigma. As Blake digs deeper, he begins to question everything. His orders, his loyalties, even his own morals. The line between right and wrong becomes blurrier with every revelation. Steele isn't just investing in companies. He's playing a much bigger game, one that could change the very fabric of the American economy. But how far will Blake go to expose the truth? Will he follow the law or his instincts? As Blake gets closer to the truth, he realizes that the people he trusts the most may not be what they seem. The FBI, the people who've sworn to uphold justice, are entangled in the very system they're supposed to fight. With his career and life on the line, Blake must make an impossible choice. Continue the investigation and risk everything, or walk away and let the corruption thrive. The deeper Blake digs, the more he risks losing himself to the very darkness he's trying to expose. Will he uncover the truth, or will the truth destroy him? The stakes are higher than ever, and the game is just beginning. Rick stood tall, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the courtroom with a sense of ownership. The air was thick with tension as his gaze locked onto Amanda, seated in the front row, poised and calm. There was something about her presence, something that gnawed at him, pulling at the edges of his control. She sat there, unmoving, like a statue carved from marble, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The silence around her seemed to pulse, echoing louder with every breath he took that he couldn't quite place it. Why did she make him uneasy? Was it her composed demeanor? Her quiet strength? Amanda wasn't speaking, wasn't reacting. She was simply there. But in Rick's eyes, that was the problem. She didn't belong in that seat. She didn't belong here, in his world of rules, of power, where silence was a sign of submission, not defiance. He had spent years building his reputation, cementing his authority over the people around him. He had faced countless challenges, dealt with those who tried to disrupt the natural order. But this woman, Amanda Lee, this was different. Her presence was a challenge he didn't know how to face. The courtroom was full, but all he saw was her. The whispers from the other officers, the cautious glances from the jurors, none of it mattered. He could feel their eyes on him, waiting for him to make the first move. They were watching, waiting for him to exert his power, to crush any threat to the system they all relied on. But Amanda was different. She wasn't the usual disruptor who came to challenge him. She wasn't an outsider seeking attention or an amateur trying to rile him up. This was no ordinary woman. Amanda was confident, calm, composed, too composed. As the seconds stretched into what felt like minutes, Rick's heart pounded louder in his chest. His breathing grew shallow, his muscles tense. It was almost as if she was reading him, seeing through the carefully constructed layers of authority he had built around himself, that he could feel his grip on the situation slipping. He needed to do something, anything, With a flick of his wrist, he snapped, "Get up, get out now." His voice was firm, commanding. His words sliced through the air, cutting the silence into jagged pieces. Amanda didn't flinch. She didn't move. She didn't speak. That silence, that stillness, only fed his anger. Rick's eyes narrowed as he took a step toward her, his body coiling with the anticipation of what he thought would be his victory. But instead of the compliance he expected, she sat there, unmoved, unshaken. His pulse quickened, a sense of unease creeping into his chest. Was she testing him? Challenging him? The room seemed to hold its breath. Every eye was on them, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. The weight of the moment pressed down on him. He could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him, their judgment weighing heavily. For the first time, Rick wasn't sure of his next move. He snapped again, louder this time, his voice sharp with fury. But still, Amanda remained unmoved. And then, like a sudden crack in the earth, the judge's voice shattered the silence, sending shockwaves through Rick's mind. "You just assaulted the new chief of police, Dr. Amanda Lee." Time seemed to freeze. The words echoed in his ears, each syllable a death knell to his carefully constructed world of control and dominance. His legs wobbled, his hands trembling. Amanda wasn't just an intruder. She was his superior. She was the one who had the power to bring him to his knees with a single decision. Rick's world, the world he had worked so hard to build, was collapsing in front of him. The foundation beneath his feet cracked, and he was falling faster than he could comprehend. Amanda was no longer a potential disruptor. She was the force that was about to tear everything down. As he stood there, a man who had never once felt vulnerable, he realized too late that the power he thought he held was nothing more than an illusion. The air in the courtroom was still as death. Rick's heart pounded in his chest, but no sound reached his ears except the hammering of his own pulse. His gaze remained locked on Amanda, the woman he had just tried to throw out, the woman he had just humiliated. But now her silence had become his undoing. The judge's voice pierced the tension, cold and unyielding. "You just assaulted the new chief of police, Dr. Amanda Lee," the judge announced, her words resonating like thunder in the stillness. The world around Rick seemed to collapse in slow motion. His body felt numb, as though the ground had given way beneath him, leaving him suspended in a moment he could neither escape nor change. Amanda, who had been nothing more than an annoyance, an intruder to his sense of power, was now the one who could destroy him with a mere glance. She wasn't just a disruptor. She was his superior, his judge, and his executioner all in one. For the first time in his life, Rick felt fear. It wasn't the fear of losing a case or of facing a challenge. No, this was something deeper. It was the paralyzing fear of losing everything: the career, the respect, the power he had fought so hard to maintain. The walls of the courtroom seemed to close in on him, the gaze of every pair of eyes in the room pressing down like a 1,000-pound weight. His colleagues sat in stunned silence. Not a word was spoken. Rick could feel their eyes on him, but none of them moved. None of them intervened. In that moment, he realized the bitter truth. He was alone. For years, Rick had ruled with an iron fist. He had been the one to silence those who dared to speak out, to break those who crossed him. He had built a fortress around himself, surrounding himself with allies who feared him, respected him, even admired him. But now, in this single moment, his fortress was crumbling, and none of those allies were stepping forward. They weren't even looking at him. His friends, his colleagues, the ones who had always stood by him in the past, were now avoiding his gaze. Some turned their heads, others looked at the floor. None of them made a sound, none of them made a move. It was as though they were all afraid to acknowledge what had just happened, afraid to be pulled into the storm that was unfolding. Rick's mind raced, but it was too late. The damage had been done. His career, built on years of power and control, was slipping through his fingers. The room felt colder now, emptier. The walls, once so full of admiration for him, now seemed to echo with nothing but the sound of his own defeat. Amanda didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Her silence, her stillness, was enough to remind Rick of the one simple truth he had ignored for so long. Power wasn't about force. It was about who held the truth, who held the key to what was right. The judge looked at him with cold, unblinking eyes. "You'll be placed under investigation for your actions," she stated, her voice final. "Dr. Lee has the power to fire you on the spot. You've lost control of this room and of your life." Rick tried to speak, to defend himself, but the words caught in his throat. His mouth was dry, his legs shaking beneath him. He opened his mouth again, but no sound came out. He wanted to explain, to somehow reclaim the control he had lost. But the more he tried, the more he realized that his words would mean nothing. The reality of his situation was undeniable as Amanda stood and walked out of the courtroom. A figure of quiet authority, Rick stood frozen, the weight of his own downfall crushing him. His colleagues still didn't look at him. The door clicked shut behind Amanda, and the room seemed to exhale a collective breath. The silence that followed was deafening, a silence that spoke louder than any words ever could. In that moment, Rick knew that the world he had built, the power he had so carefully crafted, was gone, and no one was coming to save him. The weight of the world had been placed squarely on Amanda Lee's shoulders. She stood at the precipice of something darker than she had ever imagined, a truth buried beneath layers of corruption, violence, and systemic silence. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she opened the files, the dusty records of cases that had long been forgotten by the department, swept under the rug of convenience and corruption. But Amanda wasn't like the others. She wasn't afraid to peel back the layers, to uncover the truth, no matter how painful. The first file she opened was from a case nearly a decade ago. The arrest of a young black man named Elijah, who had been dragged into a confrontation by Rick Holston. A confrontation that had escalated in the blink of an eye. The report stated that Elijah had been uncooperative. But there was something about the way the words were written, the tone, that felt off. The details were vague, the statements inconsistent, the evidence sparse. The report barely even mentioned Rick's role in the incident. Yet it was clear from the way the report was filed that the system had protected him. Amanda felt a chill crawl down her spine. She read through the case again, more carefully this time, and the truth hit her like a ton of bricks. Elijah had been a victim, caught in a system that had failed him, failed his family, and failed every person of color who had ever been wronged by the very institution meant to protect them. Rick had abused his power, had used his badge to intimidate, to control, to destroy. And the worst part was, this wasn't an isolated incident. As Amanda dug deeper into Rick's past, the pieces began to fall into place. Case after case, they all followed the same pattern: minorities targeted, evidence manipulated, accusations silenced. Rick Holston had built his career on the backs of people like Elijah, people who didn't have the power to fight back, people whose voices had been erased. The truth was ugly, it was heartbreaking, but it was undeniable. But it wasn't just the victims who haunted her. Amanda found herself confronting the faces of those who had protected Rick, the colleagues who had turned a blind eye to the truth, the judges who had signed off on the cases, the officers who had stood by his side. They were complicit in his crimes, each one of them guilty in their own way, guilty of silence, of turning away when they knew what was happening. As the files stacked up, Amanda could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on her chest. She wasn't just uncovering a history of Rick's abuse. She was unearthing the very foundation of a broken system. And with each piece of evidence, the pain of the past seemed to come alive, reverberating through her own memories, through the faces of her own family, of her own father, who had suffered at the hands of men like Rick. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface for years now bubbled up, raw and unrelenting. But it wasn't just anger. It was sorrow. Amanda thought of the countless lives ruined by people like Rick, the mothers who had buried their sons, the fathers who had been robbed of their daughters, the children who would never see their parents come home. The tears she had shed in private now burned in her eyes, a fire that refused to be extinguished. She sat there, staring at the screen, her heart heavy with the weight of everything she had uncovered. It was too much to bear. She closed her eyes, letting the tears fall. She had known this was going to be difficult, but she hadn't known it would be this painful. But the truth had to be told. Amanda couldn't stop now. She couldn't turn away. For Elijah, for her father, for every single person who had been silenced by Rick Holston and the system that had allowed him to thrive. She would finish this, no matter the cost. The truth had to come out, and Amanda was the one who would make sure it did. The air in Amanda Lee's office was thick with tension, as though the very walls themselves were holding their breath. The files before her were old, some of them frayed at the edges, stained with the fingerprints of years of neglect. Amanda didn't hesitate. She pulled out Elijah's case file, the one she had glanced at before but hadn't fully opened. She knew it was a key part of something bigger, a key part of a tragedy hidden in plain sight. As she opened the worn folder, the faint smell of old paper and ink filled the air. The case details were sparse, deliberately so, as if someone had intentionally left gaps. Elijah, a young black man, just 19, had been stopped by Rick Holston for what seemed to be a routine questioning. But nothing about that night was routine. The report was riddled with inconsistencies. Officer accounts that didn't line up, witness statements that were mysteriously absent, and most telling of all, a lack of evidence that the altercation had ever been anything but a standard stop and frisk. But Amanda knew the truth wasn't in the words on the paper. It was in what was left unsaid. She sifted through the case, her mind racing. The more she read, the more she felt the presence of a cover-up lurking beneath the surface. There were mentions of bruises on Elijah's body. Nothing severe, just a few marks here and there. But the medical examiner's report had vanished. No photographs, no further documentation. Just empty space where truth should have been. Her heart began to race. She leaned forward, her eyes scanning the documents in a frenzy. She had seen this before, the erasure of evidence, the deliberate oversight of the system to protect one of their own. Rick Holston had used his badge as a shield, and now, as Amanda peered into the black void of missing records, she saw the pattern emerging. Rick had twisted the truth. He had destroyed lives to keep his empire intact. Then, at the bottom of the case file, hidden between the last few pages, was something that made her stop dead in her tracks. A photograph. It was grainy, dark, the lighting poor, but the scene was unmistakable. It was Elijah, standing with his hands raised, facing Rick, who stood inches away, his hand gripping Elijah's wrist, twisting it behind his back. The raw emotion on Elijah's face, fear, confusion, desperation, was clear. And behind that moment there was another. A moment where Rick's eyes glinted with the cold certainty of someone who knew he was untouchable. But the photograph wasn't the only thing that shocked Amanda. Beneath it, in barely legible handwriting, was a note. Do whatever it takes to make him comply. No witnesses. We clean this up later. Amanda's stomach churned. She knew exactly what that note meant. It wasn't just about silencing Elijah. It was about making sure no one would ever know the truth. No one would ever question Rick's authority. The system had not only failed Elijah, it had actively aided in his abuse. Her breath caught in her throat as her fingers brushed over the note. She could feel the anger rising in her chest, a fire that had been smoldering for years, now erupting with the full force of everything she had uncovered. The truth was more brutal than she had anticipated. This wasn't just a case of a bad apple. It was a systematic rot. A web of lies spun by someone who believed they could do whatever they wanted, without consequences. Amanda slammed the folder shut. Her hands shook, but her resolve hardened. She couldn't stop now. She had to bring this to light, even if it meant confronting every demon, every truth buried so deep beneath the surface. But as she turned to face the cold, empty room, she realized something. This was just the beginning. Elijah was only one of many. And Rick, he wasn't the only one who had to answer for his actions. The truth was far worse than she ever expected. And now, there was no turning back. Amanda Lee sat at her desk, the dim light of her office casting long shadows across the piles of paperwork before her. The walls of her office, once a symbol of her hard-earned position, now felt suffocating, as if the very air in the room was charged with the weight of the secrets she was about to unleash. Her hands trembled, but not from fear. No, this was something else. Something darker. It was the realization that she was standing on the edge of a precipice, one that could either save or destroy her. She had spent days, weeks even, piecing together the truth, the old cases, the missing files, the corruption that had run unchecked for far too long. And now, armed with irrefutable evidence, she was ready to act. The first file she opened was the one that started it all, the case of Elijah. It wasn't just about one officer's abuse of power. It was about the system that allowed it to happen, the system that had protected Rick Holston and others like him. She was holding a smoking gun in her hands, and the only question now was how far she was willing to push. She slammed her fist on the desk, the papers scattering across the room. Rick was only the beginning. Amanda knew there were more cases, more officers who had abused their power in ways that went unnoticed, unpunished. She had seen it before, the way the department swept things under the rug, the way they covered up the truth to maintain their precious image of perfection. But now, as Amanda stared down the cold, hard reality of the corruption she had uncovered, she realized there was no turning back. The phone in her hand felt heavy as she dialed the number. Each ring seemed to stretch on forever. Finally, the voice on the other end answered, calm and measured. It was Lieutenant Raleigh, the very person who had helped Rick build his empire of lies. The person who had been complicit in the cover-ups, the silence, the manipulation. "I need you to listen carefully," Amanda said, her voice low but resolute. "I'm reopening the cases. All of them. The ones you thought were buried. The ones you thought you'd gotten away with. I'm bringing everything to light. And I'm starting with Rick." There was a pause on the other end and then a laugh. A short, dry sound that made Amanda's skin crawl. "You really think you can take down Rick? Or are you just chasing ghosts? You're out of your league, Amanda." She let the silence hang between them, her fingers tightening around the phone. "The ghosts are real, Raleigh, and I'm not afraid of them anymore." The tension was palpable. Amanda could almost hear the gears turning in Raleigh's mind. He knew she had the power to do it. She had the evidence, and now she had the authority. But what he didn't know was just how far she was willing to go. For Elijah, for her father, for every person whose life had been destroyed by the system, she would stop at nothing. The truth was a dangerous thing to expose. Amanda knew the risks. The department would fight back, try to discredit her, silence her, just as they had done to so many others. But she also knew that she was the only one who could do this. She was the only one who had the courage to face the darkness head-on. The phone call ended with nothing more than a click. But in that moment, Amanda knew that she had made her choice. She wasn't going to back down. She wasn't going to let Rick or anyone else destroy more lives to protect their own. The war had begun, and Amanda Lee was ready to fight. The truth was coming, and there was no stopping it. The whispers had started slowly at first. Just a few murmurs in the hallways of the precinct, a comment here, a raised eyebrow there. But soon, the rumors spread like wildfire, growing louder, more vicious. Amanda Lee was a traitor. She was jeopardizing the reputation of the force. She was digging up old wounds that should have stayed buried. The smear campaign against her came quickly, anonymous letters, social media posts, phone calls. The people she thought she could trust turned their backs. But Amanda stood firm, even when it felt like the walls were closing in around her. And the days that followed, the media vultures circled. They painted her as a whistleblower, a disgruntled officer looking for attention. The headlines screamed about her past grievances, her supposed vendetta against the system, all the while ignoring the truth she was desperately trying to expose. But Amanda didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice, didn't try to counter the lies. She knew that the truth would stand on its own. It always did. Despite the attacks on her character, Amanda's strength didn't waver. In fact, it only grew. She wasn't fighting for her reputation anymore. She was fighting for those who had been forgotten, for those who had been silenced. She had uncovered the darkest corners of the department, the quiet racism, the abuse of power, the systemic corruption that had been allowed to fester for decades. Each case, each story of abuse, was another brick in the wall that had been built to protect the guilty. That as the days turned into weeks, something unexpected happened. Amanda began to receive messages, texts, emails, handwritten notes, some from people she had never met. They came from victims who had suffered in silence, from families who had been wronged, from ordinary citizens who had seen the cracks in the system but were too afraid to speak out. Their words were simple, but they were powerful. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for being brave. The community that had once been silent, that had watched in fear, began to rally behind her. They saw her not as a traitor, but as a hero. She was their voice, their champion, the one who refused to turn a blind eye to the injustices they had suffered. In a city that had been built on secrets, Amanda was the one lighting the way for the truth to emerge. But even more surprising than the support was the solidarity from the officers still in the department. Some had been hesitant at first, unsure of where they stood in the face of the corruption they had all been complicit in. But as the evidence mounted, as Amanda revealed layer after layer of abuse, the quiet murmurs of discontent began to turn into louder voices demanding change. Officers who had once turned away from the truth were now speaking out, offering their testimonies, their support. They knew that the change was coming, and it was going to come from within as the investigation gained momentum. Amanda stood at the center of it all, feeling the weight of the truth she had uncovered and the lives she had touched. For every life that had been ruined by Rick Holston and his corrupt colleagues, there were 10 more who now believed in the possibility of justice. Amanda Lee had become more than just a police officer. She had become a symbol of defiance in the face of overwhelming power, a symbol of strength in the face of impossible odds. But the battle was far from over. The road ahead was still fraught with danger, with threats of retaliation, smear tactics, and the looming possibility of failure. But for the first time, Amanda felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. She wasn't alone. The community was with her. The truth was on her side. And now, nothing could stop her. The deeper Amanda Lee dug into the heart of the department's corruption, the more she found herself tangled in a web of lies and secrets far darker than she had ever imagined. It was as if every revelation, every new piece of evidence, led her down a path she wasn't sure she was prepared to walk. Yet she couldn't stop. The truth had a way of dragging you forward, even when it threatened to destroy everything you thought you knew. It started innocently enough. Another set of old case files, another batch of forgotten victims. But as Amanda sifted through the pages, something caught her eye. A name: Anthony Hathaway, her father. The name was buried deep within a report she hadn't seen before, tucked between reports of police misconduct and claims of brutality, as though it was nothing more than another casualty of a broken system. But it wasn't just a name. It was a nightmare she had never been able to fully escape, the shadow that had loomed over her entire life. Her breath caught in her throat as she read on. Anthony Hathaway had died in an incident almost 20 years ago, an incident that had never made the headlines, one that had been swiftly buried by the department. But the details in the report were chilling. It wasn't a simple case of a man caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. No, this was different. Anthony Hathaway had been shot by an officer, Rick Holston. The revelation hit Amanda like a punch to the gut. She read the report again, then again, as though she could somehow make sense of it, as though the words might change. But they didn't. Her father, the man who had raised her, the man who had always told her to stand up for what was right, had been killed by Rick Holston, the very man she had been trying to expose, the same man who had destroyed so many lives. The more she read, the more she pieced together. Rick had lied, as he always had, claiming that Anthony Hathaway had been a threat, that he had acted in self-defense. But there were no witnesses. The evidence was scant, and the report was filled with inconsistencies. Amanda knew what had happened. Rick had killed her father, and then the department had erased it all. They had buried it beneath lies, beneath the weight of their own corruption, and they had done it all to protect one of their own. Tears blurred her vision, but she wiped them away quickly. Amanda Lee didn't have the luxury of breaking down. Not now. She had a responsibility to her father, to the victims, and to the truth. But the deeper she dug, the more resistance she faced. Colleagues who had once quietly supported her now turned their backs. The higher-ups in the department pushed back harder than ever before, trying to discredit her, trying to silence her with threats of termination, of ruin. They knew what was at stake now. They knew that if Amanda continued, everything would unravel. The lies, the corruption, the cover-ups that had been built over decades. Amanda could feel the pressure mounting. It wasn't just the weight of her father's death that haunted her anymore. It was the sheer magnitude of what she was about to expose. She wasn't just going after Rick Holston. She was going after the very system that had allowed him, and so many others, to thrive in their corruption. And that system would not go down without a fight. But there was no turning back. Amanda had already seen too much. She had already crossed too many lines. The truth was no longer a choice. It was a necessity. And if she had to tear the department apart piece by piece to get it, so be it. As she closed the file, the weight of her father's death resting heavy on her shoulders, Amanda Lee knew that the battle had changed. This was no longer just about Rick. This was about exposing a system so broken, so vile, that it could never be fixed without first destroying everything it had built. And she was the one who would bring it all down. The weight of the truth was suffocating. Amanda Lee had spent months uncovering the darkest corners of the department, sifting through lies, corruption, and a web of deceit that had been carefully spun over decades. But now, as the final pieces of evidence fell into place, Amanda knew that the moment of reckoning had arrived. The truth she had so tirelessly fought for, the truth that had been buried for so long, was about to break through the surface, and there would be no turning back. She sat in the dim glow of her office, the piles of files and documents scattered across her desk like a map of her journey. Her hands were steady as she prepared the final report. It was a dossier like no other, each page a testament to the brutality of Rick Holston, to the lives destroyed by his unchecked power, to the officers and officials who had turned a blind eye and silenced those who dared to speak out. She knew that once the world saw what she had uncovered, it would change everything. Rick wouldn't just be exposed, he would be held accountable, and the department would never be the same. Amanda's heart pounded in her chest as she picked up the phone. The media had been waiting for her to make a move, and now, finally, it was time to deliver the truth to the public. With a deep breath, she dialed the number of the investigative reporter who had been covering her story for weeks, a man who had become an ally in her mission to bring the department's corruption into the light. "This is it," Amanda said, her voice unwavering. "I'm ready to go public. Let's do this." The reporter's response was immediate, his voice full of anticipation and determination. "Are you sure, Amanda? This will change everything. The backlash is going to be massive. They'll try to bury it, just like they did with everything else." "I know," she replied, her voice quiet but resolute. "But the truth doesn't belong in the shadows anymore. It's time to expose it all. The people deserve to know." As the press release went live, the media storm erupted. Headlines flashed across screens, dominating social media feeds, and the world began to wake up to the truth Amanda had fought so hard to reveal. Rick Holston, the man who had been protected for so long, was now a target. His past of abuse, manipulation, and racial bias was laid bare for all to see. The department's systemic corruption, the cover-ups, the lives ruined, the families torn apart. All of it came crashing to the surface. But even as the story spread like wildfire, Amanda could feel the resistance closing in around her. Powerful voices within the department and beyond began to rally against her, trying to discredit the evidence she had uncovered. Smear campaigns, threats, and attempts to silence her continued to pour in. They didn't want the truth to get out. They didn't want the public to see the rot that had festered within their institutions for so long. Yet, Amanda Lee remained unbroken. She refused to back down. With every attempt to silence her, she grew stronger. The public outcry grew louder. People from all walks of life, from every corner of the community, began to speak up. Victims who had suffered in silence for years found their voices, and families who had been shattered by the very system meant to protect them began to heal. The pressure to hold Rick and his enablers accountable intensified, and the tide began to turn as Amanda watched the world react to the truth she had unearthed. A quiet sense of satisfaction settled within her. She had never sought fame or recognition, but seeing the power of the truth, the power of resilience, she realized something profound. The quiet authority of someone who refuses to stay silent can change everything. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. There were still many fights to be fought, many lies to be uncovered. But for the first time, Amanda Lee allowed herself to believe in the power of what she had done. The truth had been exposed, and it could never be erased. No matter how hard they tried to silence her, the truth would always find a way to rise. Amanda Lee's journey was no longer just her own. It had become a movement, a beacon of hope for those who had been silenced for far too long. Her name was now synonymous with resistance, not just against the systemic corruption within the police department, but against every form of injustice that had been allowed to flourish in the shadows. Her story was a story of resilience, of defiance in the face of overwhelming odds, and of the relentless pursuit of truth that as the media continued to amplify the truth Amanda had so fearlessly uncovered, it became clear that the power structures that had once shielded Rick Holston were crumbling. The walls of protection built around him by colleagues, superiors, and even society were now shaking, one brick at a time. The truth, it seemed, had a power all its own. An unstoppable force that could dismantle even the most fortified systems of control. Amanda watched as the tide of change swept over the department, her department. What once felt like an impossible dream, seeing the corrupt brought to justice, witnessing the truth exposed for all to see, was now happening in real time. The voices of the victims, those who had been ignored, those who had suffered in silence, were finally being heard. Amanda didn't do it alone. She had inspired a community to rise with her. She had given them the courage to speak up, to demand accountability, and in doing so, she had ignited a fire that would never be extinguished. But Amanda knew that this wasn't just about one man, one department, or one city. It was about all the lives that had been affected by the corruption and silence that had been allowed to fester for too long. The victims, Elijah, her father, and countless others, had been silenced by a system that valued power over people. Amanda's fight wasn't just a fight for justice for them. It was a fight for every person who had ever felt invisible, unheard, or powerless. Through Amanda's leadership, the voices of the voiceless were no longer ignored. She had given them a platform, a chance to be seen and heard. She had shown them that even in the darkest of times, the light of truth and integrity could break through, illuminating the path forward. Amanda had proven that one person, with enough courage and determination, could start a ripple that would grow into a wave of change. And that wave was just beginning. The impact of Amanda's actions had reached beyond the department, beyond the city. People across the country began to take notice. Her story was shared, her efforts celebrated, and her leadership recognized. Amanda Lee had become a symbol of unwavering commitment to justice, a symbol of strength in the face of adversity, and most importantly, a symbol of hope for a world that was finally waking up to the reality of systemic injustice. As she looked back on everything she had accomplished, Amanda couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment. It wasn't the accolades, the recognition, or even the victory that satisfied her. It was the knowledge that she had made a difference, one that would resonate for generations to come. If Amanda's story has taught us anything, it's that change starts with us. It starts with one person standing up, speaking out, and refusing to stay silent in the face of injustice. It reminds us that no matter how powerful the forces against us may seem, the truth is always stronger. Amanda Lee's journey is proof that, even when the world tries to silence us, we can always find a way to make our voices heard. If you believe in the power of truth and the strength of resilience, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Stay tuned for more stories that inspire, educate, and empower. Together, we can continue to push for justice and be the change we want to see in the world. Amanda Lee's story is just one example of how, even in the face of darkness, the light of truth can shine brighter than ever before.